Welcome to our program. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are at the University of Maryland in College Park, and we are situated in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative, also in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. It's really my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Professor Charlotte Koo and Professor Simon Dalby. The moderator for today's program is Dr. Kate Seaman. I will introduce our speakers in just a minute. But first, just to remind you that today's program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel for those who would like to watch it later or to let other people know to join us. So today's program is a combination of the Baha'i, it is a continuation of the Baha'i Chair's exploration of the greatest challenge we face in our present world, our inability to create a peaceful world. The program is a book discussion featuring a book that the Baha'i Chair published in 2022. It's an edited volume entitled Fundamental Challenges to Global Peace and Security, The Future of Humankind. It's edited by myself, Professor Michael Allen, and Dr. Kate Seaman. The book challenges the current thinking and strategies in the field of global peace and security. Sadly, it is clear that much of the current thinking and strategies have not been effective. Today's challenges cut across borders and requires a more coordinated, collective, and connected effort to find workable solutions. The book begins with the question of global leadership and works its way back to the interconnected dynamics of global modernity and conflict. It's divided in 4 parts. I don't need to go into too much detail, but the first part basically looks at the need for more effective leadership that is more global in nature to tackle the very complex challenges that we are faced with in today's world. The second section addresses the transformations that technology is introducing to the global society, both positive and negative. The third section examines structural inequalities without addressing the underlying inequalities within the system, such as those facing women. There is no way to create a more just and equitable way of responding to global challenges. Finally, the fourth section is looking at how to develop new approaches to global peace and security, exploring how we break out of the current framework and how we can build a new, more holistic paradigm for peace. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel members. Professor Simon Dalby is Professor Emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University and Fellow at Balsillie School of International Affairs. His published research deals with climate change, environmental security, and geopolitics. He is author of Pyromania, Fire and Geopolitics in a Climate-Disrupted World. Another book, Rethinking Environmental Security and Anthropocene Geopolitics, Globalization, Security, Sustainability. And a co-editor of Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and Reframing Climate Change, Constructing Ecological Geopolitics. Professor Dalby was educated at Trinity College Dublin, the University of Victoria, and holds a PhD from Simon Fraser University. Before joining Laurier and Balsillie School, he was professor of geography, environmental studies, and political economy at Carleton University in Ottawa. Professor Charlotte Koo is professor of law and director of global programs at the Texas A&M University School of Law. Previously, she was professor of law and assistant dean for graduate and international legal studies at the University of Illinois College of Law. She served as acting director of the Lauterbach Center for International Law at the University of Cambridge and was executive director and executive vice president of the American Society of International Law. Dr. Koo presently serves as past president of the Academic Council on the United Nations system and is on the board of directors of the American branch of the International Law Association. She is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the American Law Institute. Her research focuses on international law and global governance. Recent publications include, and this is written with two other authors, Von Carter and Andrew P. Morris, Evolving Sovereignty Relationships Between Affiliated Jurisdictions, Lessons for Native American Jurisdictions. Another publication, Localizing International Law, and then U.S. Approaches to Teaching International Law in a Global Environment. The moderator of our panel today is Dr. Kate Seaman. She is the Assistant Director of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. Previously, she held positions at the University of Baltimore, the University of Bath, and was the postdoctoral fellow at the University of East Anglia. Dr. Seaman received her PhD from Lancaster University. She is the author of Untied Nations, the UN, Peacekeeping, and the Development of Global Security Governance. Dr. Seaman is the co-editor of Changing Ethos of Human Rights and co-editor of our current book that we are featuring today, Fundamental Challenges of Global Peace and Security. Her research has also been published in journals Global Governance and Politics and Governance. So welcome to our program, both Professors Koo and Dalby, and I will turn the time now over to Dr. Seaman.
Thank you, Hoda. And welcome to both Charlotte and to Simon today. So I'm hoping you can both turn on your videos. There we go. Now we can see everybody. So to begin the discussion today, I have some questions that I'm going to read out to you. I also want to flag to the audience that you can also use the question and answer box to type your questions for both Professor Koo and Professor Dalby and Professor Mahmoudi too as well. And I will be monitoring those as we go through the event today. So Charlotte, I want to start with you first, if that's okay. In your chapter, you examine the concept of responsibility in a global world and the increasing fragmentation of this. So how does the concept of responsibility help us to understand the weaknesses in our current systems of global governance and the ways that we could potentially address those weaknesses going forward?
Well, thank you, Kate. And thank you also to Professor Mahmoudi for the initial invitation to join the book project and for this ongoing conversation on these important issues. And of course, to you, Kate, for producing the book and for organizing us today. Now, as to your question, the answer to your question is sort of a good news, bad news kind of answer. The good news is that there are many capacities that we've never thought about of individuals, institutions, and other kinds of organizations that can contribute to global governance. They can take innovative action, they can respond to crises, they can even take on responsibility. So that's the good news. Lots of capacities at a variety of levels in different ways, different places. The bad news is that our current system and structure of governance does not allow us to recognize all of these innovative efforts, and therefore may not always be able to attribute responsibility or to understand whose responsibility is to whom and to what. So from a legal perspective, responsibility is a core legal concept. It defines the relationship between a government and those it is governing, between governments at multiple levels, and between sectors and segments of society to each other, including individuals to one another. When a problem arises, when a question occurs, it's quite natural and indeed correct for someone to say who is responsible for this, who is responsible and who can help the situation. The difficulty and the challenge, which is what I hope we'll get into in the course of our discussion today, is how to take the holder of that formal responsibility and translate that into effective action at whatever level action is needed. And this is the challenge we find. And this is what globalization has given us, which is that the formal holders of responsibility and where action actually can effectively take place do not align and often don't even connect. One may not even recognize the other, so that it is difficult to take action and move it through all the levels of public authority, effectiveness, legitimacy, trust, resource allocation and distribution, and all those kinds of things that we expect when we feel that there's something that needs to be done to address our personal, group, or wider needs. So this is where the fragmentation does allow us to recognize weaknesses, because we can see where there are disconnects. Why is someone not being held accountable or responsible for their actions? Well, they may not be in a place where the law or the institution actually can address it, or may address it in an improper way. So it is a diagnostic that we can use, but unfortunately it may not always produce immediate solutions. So that's the weakness, and that's sort of the good news, bad news situation that I think we're addressing with regard to understanding responsibility.
Thank you. And Simon, I'm going to turn to you now. I think there are actually some really interesting overlaps between your two chapters in terms of the idea of responsibility. So I'm excited to have you guys in conversation together. So Simon, in your chapter, you explore the connections between peace, violence, and inequality in a climate-disrupted world. And you talk about the need to think of humanity as part of the Earth system. So how does this change how we see the role of humans in shaping the future of the biosphere?
In a number of different ways, Kate. The crucial point, I think, in the discussing the Earth system and humanity's role is to recognize that we're no longer living in a world that is easily described as sort of an external environment to human affairs, where states and governments can get along with their business, the rivalries that are sometimes violent in this world. But the planet will still be there for future generations in more or less the same form. We can squabble about the territories and where the boundaries should be, who's responsible for which bit, but ultimately, when the guns fall silent and the peace treaty is signed, the planet is still more or less in the same shape as it was. And the assumption has always been that the planet will still be there for future generations to do the same games and in the future. The Earth system suggests that, in fact, humanity has now become such a large component of how the planet works that the assumptions of sort of a stable backdrop for humans is no longer valid. We have changed so many things so dramatically that we are now literally shaping the future condition of the planet on a scale that we've been slow to recognize. What this means, of course, is that we're not just responsible for actions today and in the immediate future, but our actions now are actually shaping how the planet is going to function for future generations and for many centuries in the future. So to Charlotte's theme of responsibility, the current generation has a responsibility not only to younger generations who are just coming on the scene, but to many generations hence, because what kind of stuff we put into the environment is going to shape the conditions for humanity for a very long time. And this is a fundamental sort of shift in how modernity needs to be reconceptualized. We're no longer a separate entity playing our games of rivalry and power politics on a given substrate. We're actually changing that substrate by how we play the games of power politics. And I try to pull them together very briefly in the chapter, and I've subsequently developed those arguments in more detail in terms of how we think about firepower both in terms of military use of firepower, which we're seeing all too much of in the headlines in the last few weeks, but also in terms of firepower, in terms of the ability we have to power many things using fire, as in fossil fuels. And my argument is that we've got to actually think a lot harder about how we put those bits together if we're going to think sensibly about how to tackle at least that fundamental challenge that we now all face.
Thank you. So following on from that, I want to delve a little bit more into this idea of responsibility and how we can implement a system that allows for varying levels of responsibility, I guess. So not only at the individual level, so what are our responsibilities as individuals given these challenges that we're facing on a global level, but how does that then kind of filter up through local, national, international levels, particularly in connection to challenges such as climate change, but also other issues as well. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to tackle that one first.
Shall I start? And then
Absolutely.
and Simon can help me out here. You know, I think again, the difficulty is with the complex world in which we live. And for that, what I'm suggesting is that some issues right now, the individual cannot really have much influence on. And I'll stay with this for a minute. Climate change. You can name any of the current wars that are ongoing in the world right now. These are things, these are major challenges that require incredible leadership on the part of the nations of the world. And I think one of the difficulties is, as was mentioned, this fragmentation that has taken place, where we now find that even among the leaders of the nations of the world, there is such disunity and fragmentation that there's no collective will to come together and try to find solutions to some of these very, very difficult problems. And so one could say, well, that's at the international level, and maybe individuals can, through their voice and demonstrations and all that, make a difference. But I'm not discouraging that, but I don't think that that's enough of an impetus to make a difference. Somehow, you know, one hopes that an institution like the United Nations, when it was formed, that it would have started to make a difference, especially after World War II and the scourge of that war. But now we find ourselves at a point where I would say even the United Nations is unable to really create a collective will to address these very challenging issues that we face. I'll stop there.
Hoda, if I might interject and following up on something that Simon said, I think the great challenge is that we have these institutions, as you just described, created after World War II to address a particular set of issues that supported a particular vision of world order and the like. But what we have not been very able to address is actually the point that Simon made, that actions actually now carry consequences, and consequences at a much more rapid rate than we have been accustomed to understanding. Structural change takes much longer to sort of make happen because of political interests and so forth. So I think that's one thing that's made a big difference, and that's where this kind of concept of global, I think, differs from that of international, where you sort of think of more steady state activity with units that are structured and known, interacting with each other in reasonably stable manner. And I think Simon really puts his finger on it, where this has substantially changed, not only in the climate environment, but I think in the governance environment, because actions do carry consequences and those consequences manifest much sooner now than they used to, and thereby make or render the institutions that we have that we're accustomed to going to help resolve these problems less able to resolve them, because you've created greater complexity, you've created more political interest, you may have added new voices. So one of the challenges is how to address that, not to sort of throw up one's hands and give up, but actually to address the understanding that actions do carry consequences that may manifest in a much shorter timeline than our governing institutions and processes may allow, and how to allow for that dialogue perhaps that needs to take place prior to more structured formal response. So I think a key concept is how to address the very thing Simon's addressed, which regard to actions carrying consequences, but how to work those things within kind of a collective vision of where we should head. Because if we don't, then we fragment and degrade that collective vision. And I think we see ourselves in that moment right now.
One of the things, if I can just follow up that, I mean, one of the things that I think is much in the headlines or will be in the next few weeks is, of course, the consequences and the responses, because there's been a huge discussion for many, many years in the climate change policy community about issues of loss and damage, wherein the more vulnerable and poorer states of the planet who've done very little to cause climate change are the ones that are suffering from the typhoons and the heat domes and droughts and so on. And there's been an immense struggle to get recognition on the part of the rich and powerful, for want of a better phrase, that their actions are already having severe climate consequences for many parts of the world. And trying to get a fund established whereby compensations and reconstruction funds and so on can be made available fairly quickly to deal with losses and damages caused by these extreme events has been a huge struggle. Technically, it was agreed at the last climate conference in Egypt last year that this fund would be set up. In the last week or two, there has been some headlines about the fact that there's sort of at least tentative agreements that for the next couple of years, the World Bank of all institutions will actually run these funds. But it's been an immense struggle to get people to understand the consequences, which are emerging now, of a couple of generations of profligate use of fossil fuels. And the necessity of grappling with the consequences of actions taken in the last few decades is coming home to graphically illustrate what we're now facing. Whether it's the destruction of Acapulco in that extraordinary hurricane a few weeks ago, or other disasters around the world. Actions do have consequences. They are often consequences that appear across state boundaries. And of course, that goes to the crucial point that Charlotte was making about how we reimagine a global as opposed to just an international system. But this is the world we now live in, and it behooves all of us as both scholars and activists to grapple with this new context as effectively as we can.
Thank you. And I want to follow up there a little bit on the ideas of both the structures that we have in place, but also the inbuilt inequalities within these structures, and what reforms might be needed within the global system to ensure that we're not perpetuating the same systems over again. So how can we recognize and ensure that those who are at most risk, for taking Simon's example, who are most at risk for the consequences of climate change, that their voice is more readily heard within any new reformed system? So how do we address the inequalities and kind of make sure that we don't repeat the historical patterns? And I'll come to Simon first. I think I'm going to put you on the spot for that one.
just waiting for a cue there, Kate. Okay. Look, one of the things that really worries me about this is also that the fact that there's a very clear generational politics to the climate change issue. If you were born this century, stop and think about that. If you were born this century, then you would be reasonably expecting to be having a retirement in 2070 or somewhere along the line close to those dates. Now, the point is that the decisions that are being taken now as to whether investments go into solar panels, batteries, good insulated buildings or into more oil pipelines and coal mines and so on. I mean, the decisions made now in terms of investment are going to have consequences later in this century. And we don't have institutions that very effectively engage youth because frankly, the longer you plan on living, the more consequences climate change is going to have, simply because you'll be around longer. And I think that this is one of the real challenges in present circumstances. What's particularly alarming is states invoking notions of security to actually arrest youthful protesters who are trying to get the attention of, well, my generation, what my students used to call us stale, pale males, who have made so many bad decisions about energy systems and security systems based on old thinking. In the new context, we do need to have to grapple with this. And there's a generational politics to this that I think is absolutely crucial too, which for reasons that still remain quite obscure to me, many of my colleagues of my own demographic simply have great difficulty grasping this. The fact that we are living in a new circumstances with the global emphasis on that point that Charlotte made a few minutes ago is something that we all need to grapple with. You know, criminalizing youthful protesters who are trying to demand security for their future is a retrograde step that needs to be called out very clearly by academics and activists alike. But those are the, you know, that's one of the other real challenges, because the institutions that were built simply don't fit. That said, final point. I mean, the Secretary General of the United Nations has been saying all the right things in the last little while. His Twitter feed's wonderful. I mean, he's making all the right statements, saying all the right things. But the problem is that state policymakers are not picking up on the priorities that are being very clearly articulated by that institution.
Picking up on that for a moment, if we look into our domestic politics, so this is stepping aside a little bit from institutions. The politics, of course, shape those institutions and work those institutions. In many political situations, the rewards are for immediate results. And so you look much shorter term, you look much more immediate in terms of what would appeal to voters so that you might get yourself into office. And this, again, I think runs contrary to needs of more open-ended thinking, more longer-term thinking, more trade-off thinking. None of those things are the rewards which may, win elections. And I think this is also one of the challenges we face. So it's an institution of a different kind, but yet I think at the heart of the difficulty we see with regard to exerting leadership, deploying resources in a manner that can be helpful, and things of that nature, because somehow the immediacy in terms of, or the urgency of something like a climate situation just may not be as visible from a political standpoint with regard to rewards at the ballot box.
So I'm going to bring in a question from the audience here. So this comes from Quanta, and she's asking, how can society, and I want to add in brackets here, and politicians, be made aware of the connection between the practical necessity for peace to reduce poverty, to resolve conflicts without wars and violence, and effectively deal with the myriad of environmental issues? As we know, wars usurp our financial resources for destruction, whereas peace could have the potential to help human progress. So how can we better raise awareness of this?
One reaction I will have to that is that history tells us that after episodes of great violence, that changes can happen, sometimes quite extraordinary changes. We have seen a few of these already. We've referenced some of them with regard to the aftermath of World War II, but it is now some decades after World War II. If you go back to World War I as the beginnings of some of these institutional arrangements, they are nearly a century-year-old. So the fact that they're a little bit outmoded and not quite reacting well or agilely to current challenges, I think is not a surprise. So what to do about that and how to address what the questioner said. And I think perhaps in this particular current phase of great violence and great challenge, maybe this will also provide the will and the opportunity to rethink. I think there are ideas and understandings of what needs to be done. It's just that opportunity and that leadership to pursue those, the political rewards that go with that, or for that matter, the courage just to pursue even without political reward, because you see so clearly the need. It could be that in the phase of what we are now witnessing as really great horrors around the world through war and these increasingly intense climate events that we are all experiencing, maybe this will give the focus and the impetus for us to actually undertake that new thinking that's required.
I often think about crisis leading to, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Charlotte, that it can lead to better ideas, but what worries me is how grave, how massive, how colossal should that crisis be. And I'm not sure, but that's the difficulty in this case. I mean, will it always be a crisis that motivates change? And I don't know. I don't know how big it has to be the next time, let's say.
In some cases, there are very direct connections between individual behavior and global politics. In the climate situation, which I've been watching for far too long, one of the tipping points at the moment, of course, is that the new technologies for heating and cooling, the so-called heat pumps, or sometimes in the United States they're called mini splits for a reason I don't understand, but nonetheless they're electrically powered. There's a huge controversy in Canada at the moment about trying to get these into people's houses, and big fights about carbon taxes and the prices of fuel. Of course, the crucial point here is that the vulnerabilities that people have, both in terms of actually getting supplies of fuel and also in terms of being able to afford to pay for those supplies if they are accessible, makes people both economically and in terms of oncoming winter vulnerable to not having the necessities for heating. If we can disconnect much of the infrastructure for heating and cooling from fossil fuels, then we are making people a whole lot less vulnerable directly in terms of them being able to heat and cool their houses electrically. But we're also simultaneously reducing the amount of fossil fuels needed for the energy grid too. So insofar as international politics is often tied in to the insecurities connected with fossil fuel deliveries and pricing, then the local is the global in terms of these connections. Interesting headlines in the last couple of weeks about fears of power blackouts in Egypt, precisely because the war in Gaza is getting the Israelis to not export natural gas or to Egypt, so that the disruptions, or at least the potential future disruptions of gas supplies across that region, is making electricity a problem in Egypt if you're not dependent on those fossil fuel supplies coming across borders and being dependent on the strange marketing arrangements that the International Petroleum in particular is structured through. Then you've got a much more secure population. You've got one that is secure in both senses of economic security and reliable buildings, but also is reducing the global climate change issue as well. And I think that there's some technological innovations that go directly to our lives, whether it's electric vehicles or heat pumps, or in my case, my old legs love my electric bike because I can get up hills, which I couldn't, and it encourages me to go out and get some air and exercise and transport myself using a bike across the hills where I'm living. It's a struggle if you don't have that bit of electrical assistance. Again, this also reduces my use of vehicles that burn fossil fuels. There's lots of little things like this, but we need to join up these dots much more effectively in policy discourse, because bicycles are wonderful things for all sorts of reasons. They've got huge potential for development in various places where a bit of electrical assist will make a huge difference. But we've got to start thinking about, quite literally, what we are making for a planet. If we're not dependent on those fossil fuels coming across borders, they're much less of an issue in terms of international politics too. And these are the kinds of connections that politicians need to make, but citizens need to get on their politicians and get them to make those connections. And that's the crucial point in present circumstances.
I think, Simon, the point you just made with your electric bike example goes to Hoda's question really about, so what can individual actions do to address some of these bigger issues? Because if one looks into a daily life, and circumstances will differ depending on where you are and what you're doing and who you are and so forth, there could be choices. There could be choices that are made, some which are same old, some which maybe could advance something new. And if it's the choices there, you can see it, it's affordable, it's doable, and all of that, one might go for it. And I think over time actually can go pretty quickly, maybe, just, tens and 20s, but, before you know, it's hundreds and thousands of communities or individuals or, whatever unit you're talking about that may be adopting some kind of behavior that could make more of a difference. So what kind of difference could that make? It could make a difference to demonstrate to others that something can work and actually make a difference, so that individual actions, Hoda, actually can have bigger impacts. Because I think that is a frustration. What can my small action today do to affect something else? Well, if you join forces with 10 others who are doing similar small actions, maybe this will say that this is actually doable, and doable, without great cost or without great effort, and maybe will in fact better your life in some manner. And I think this can also inform the governance side, which says, there's not great liability here. There's not great need for extra cost. People are either willing to pay, or maybe over time you're even saving money. So I think you just sort of have to let it sort of go, but then you have to be in a position to be able to assess what effect that is having, so that you get that encouragement that in fact what you're doing is in fact advancing something and maybe hitting multiple channels. But it's sort of having something at a higher level observe small actions and in some public way, and we're not very good at doing that. At least in the United States, we're not so good at doing that. Public authority seems to go on its own. We have media that is kind of on its own, channel. We have just so many channels. We don't have a single place where these, good actions and constructive efforts actually can gain some form of recognition. It does happen, but it takes longer than I think optimal for the kinds of issues that we're trying to deal with right now.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in another audience question. This one is from John McLaughlin. How can individuals then best influence national leaders to pursue the pressing issues related to peace, which don't provide the short-term political rewards that we've already talked about? It seems that a standard fallback strategy is protest and lobbying, but surely there are more effective ways for individuals to contribute to promoting peace, so that material, financial, and human resources can be redirected towards addressing the big global issues such as climate change. Hoda, do you want to try that one first?
I don't.
Perhaps I'll just say a few things of that. There's no one answer to that. It depends on which jurisdiction you are, what the political circumstances you find yourself in are. The idea about bikes and whatever, well, with that goes getting local municipalities to put infrastructure in, modifying roadways, putting bike lanes in, making sure that your local supermarket actually has a bike rack where you can lock up your bike while you're doing your shopping. I mean, it's those simple little things that do make a difference, but they're different in each jurisdiction, and each town and city is going to have a different handle to work with on this. In terms of municipalities, getting them to put some basic infrastructure in, getting the building codes changed so that it makes putting solar panels on your roof easy, those kinds of things, they're different from town to town, city to city. And so there's no one simple answer. The old questions of lobbying and protests still matter. They do influence public opinion. And in the extraordinary circumstances in the Netherlands earlier this year, where thousands and thousands of people simply sat down on a highway and stayed there for week after week, despite the arrests, despite the water cannon being turned loose on them. There's an extraordinary video of a musical group, a little orchestra, who actually at one stage had their instruments apparently confiscated by the cops, and they showed up next day to mime the performance. I mean, marvelous piece of political theater, but eventually the Dutch government is getting serious about ramping up its climate actions as a result of this kind of action. So protests do still matter, lobbying does still matter. And for goodness sake, keep at it, but find the angle in your local community as well, in terms of your municipality or your local government, and go to work on the politicians there, so that the rules and regulations that facilitate doing sensible things can be worked on. Does this necessarily translate into global peace? Well, not necessarily, although clearly reducing the environmental impacts of many of our activities in the long run will cause less climate disruption, will make life easier to adapt to in our new circumstances. And with a bit of luck, that will help reduce the inclinations of politicians to use violence and conflict to try and remain in control in an increasingly disrupted world. So it does all fit together, but there's no simple answer. You need to look to the local circumstances where you find yourself. And also, I mean, frankly, you also need to think about, well, what am I going to study if you're a student, so that I actually get skills that are useful in terms of making a better world. For students in particular, you've got to stop and think about this, where what it is that you're studying might be useful down the road too, in terms of building a better world. No easy answers there. There's no magic button that can be pressed. You have to stop and consider the circumstances in which you find yourself and act accordingly.
But those circumstances also may tell you where you have some opportunity. So in some countries, in some jurisdictions, one could pursue litigation. This is not the best and speediest approach, but it certainly can help to identify at least what responsibility might be, where dots do not connect, where there could be financial liability. Finance, for better or for worse, is one way to focus people's minds. Simon, you spoke about the loss and damage and considerations coming up. This gives a tangibility to issues like climate change, which many otherwise would not have. Once you begin to put dollar signs towards something, you begin to understand a little bit more, and different communities may be able to relate to that in a more tangible manner, including, I think, in terms of political interests. So not that everything should be monetized, but it is, I think, a factor in some of these to help understand the scope of responsibility, to understand the scope of the consequence of the action, small, albeit small in your own individual case, towards something larger, because it's something that you can understand. And that's, I think, one of the challenges as part of leadership, to communicate in a manner that allows people to understand what their small action either has consequence or how it relates to something larger. But this is difficult to do when the matter itself may be complicated, when you've got multiple expertises and things of this nature. And I think we saw some of those missteps through the entire COVID business. Exactly what you should do. What is this thing all about? How do I protect myself? Why should I care about anyone else? All of those things, I think, we saw play through during the various phases of managing the COVID epidemic. And I think communication and the leadership that goes with that is also very much a part of this. And of course, conditions politics at the end of the day as well.
Thank you. So through some of the questions, there's also been a theme about how do we engage with the younger generations, with young people who are increasingly feeling disconnected from governance structures that aren't responding to their concerns and to their issues. So what can we do, or how do we ensure that the next generation does continue to engage both locally and globally? And then also, again, thinking about these systems and structures we have in place, how do they need to change to better incorporate the kind of next generation into them?
I think, innovation and great ideas, it's exciting, you pursue them, but there gets to be a frustration where you don't feel you can go very far with these things. And this is where I think there needs to be an understanding amongst innovators, whether they're young or older, that you do need to connect with existing structures, because the existing structures is what will give you that, market access, that regulatory kind of approval, those accountability systems that, allow for, capital to flow and things of this nature. So that's on the side of the innovator and perhaps for the younger person. On the more established side, there needs to be an understanding that the established structures and the established sort of how you made your fortune or did well at one point in time. First of all, that idea goes quickly. Simon is sitting at the Balsillie School where they had the RIM that had the BlackBerry. This incredible technology then very quickly became outmoded. So I think even amongst entrepreneurs, there's an understanding that things come and go quickly. So you want to capture those new ideas, but use what you have, which is the structure, the market access, the know-how, the connections, the regulatory force. So it's both from government as well as from establishment that we can benefit from each other. But how to sort of facilitate that dialogue, facilitate and make those connections. This is what I think we are lacking in the public space anyway. Perhaps in the business space, they're doing better. You allow for a good idea to go, and then you sort of purchase it once it looks like it's got some legs. In the governance space, we don't quite have that, and we really need it in order to capture where those good governing ideas are, to somehow connect them to the existing structures. And not one size fits all. That's something I think we also have difficulty understanding. Simon was describing very much a municipal environment with regard to the use of bikes. Well, in the rural environment, perhaps this would be different. Though I know in the Netherlands, people bicycle great distances. In some other places, when you're starting to talk about these things, it will say, well, that's, those are those city folks talking, not, those of us who live in the country where, we would hardly be getting on a bike to, go to whatever it is we're going to do. So I think the ability to pick up differences, to spot like innovations, and to be honest about when maybe something is working up to a point or maybe working not at all, but not punishing for failure, but actually rewarding for the sort of the courage to experiment and the courage to try to communicate with a bigger audience. But for then the bigger audience, that is the existing authority and structure, not necessarily to punish either, but to say thank you, but try again. We, as a matter of governance, just are not so well equipped to do those sorts of things.
I also think that the younger generation, it depends. I mean, we're talking, at least from my perspective, from very much a Western angle. I'm thinking about the rest of the world, where some of these possibilities are simply not there for their young people. The opportunities are simply not there. And this notion that the younger generation, just as any generation, should really think about ways that they can help without dictating, but assist other countries, other populations with issues that are just as relevant to them as the Western world. And I'm not asking that the young people in the Western world go and tell people in the Eastern world or wherever what to do. That's not my intention here, or the global South. But I do think there has to be a greater awareness about how these problems that we're talking about, whether it's climate, whether it's governance, whether it's global versus international, that the younger generation should be made to feel in a way emboldened by the possibilities that they have in this regard, in whatever setting they might find themselves in. I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually leads nicely into a question from the audience from Malik Wilson. who's asking, in a moment of great stridency and nationalism, how do you sell the notion more existentially that we need all of each other to settle big problems? So in a moment when some would rather have the ship go down than ask for help from certain others, how can the notion of broad global cooperation be advanced? That's a big question. Simon looks like he has an answer.
I'll have a crack at it. I don't have an answer for it. I don't have a simple answer for it. But in terms of where I started the discussion with the Earth system and all the rest of it is the larger cultural politics that we're now playing out with. In some cases, it does seem to be transnational. People are involved with all sorts of communities that sometimes don't seem to respect national boundaries at all. Climate change movements, for instance, have been one of those things. Trying to understand how teenagers are using social media these days is probably completely beyond me. But the crucial point is that there are modes of communication here that are proliferating in ways that I think facilitate communication, because geography is much less of an issue than it used to be, precisely because of social media. On the other hand, the social media is being abused by all sorts of nationalist politicians for nefarious purposes simultaneously. The difficulty, of course, is to get the communications across borders. And again, exchange programs. If you happen to be a student in a university, for goodness sake, find a few people that don't come from your part of the world and go talk to them about how the world seems from their perspective. Universities should be doing this much more effectively than they are, but encouraging practical dialogue. Okay, well, how do you see this issue? You come from wherever it is elsewhere in the world. I think all students have got an opportunity to do that if they're willing to actually reach out to people who don't look like them, don't speak like them, but might have much to teach them. And I think that the larger questions of dialogue and intercultural discussions are ever more important in terms of how we do this thing. I mean, just look at the national origins of those of us on this webinar. We all come from different parts of the world, and I think that this matters in terms of we're able to do this in terms of this new technology of Zooming and virtual meetings. There's very considerable potential there, but it does require actively reaching out to find people in other parts of the world to have a dialogue with. Because frankly, in many parts of the world, similar vulnerabilities are being faced. Fuel bills, and I emphasize fuel bills, not energy bills. Please disconnect those two things. They are not the same thing, although the oil industry loves to conflate them just to confuse us all. Are things that people face in numerous parts of the world. And thinking about how we power our societies, how we get about, how we keep our houses comfortable, requires thinking about technologies and that don't use fuel, because that's absolutely crucial to solving the climate problem. People around the world have got these issues in all sorts of different ways, but having those kinds of dialogues, find somebody at your university campus that comes from a different part of the world and say, look, the world's in a mess. Can we talk about how you see it from your part of the world? Those kinds of dialogues are simple, practical things. They also actually do make you feel more empowered, simply because you're connecting with people and thinking about the big problems. So that's my 2 bits worth for all the university students that are tuned in.
I think we started, Kate, with the discussion about fragmented responsibility. I think ways to cultivate concepts of sharing responsibility perhaps is also a vehicle here. We have, unfortunately, episodes that really can focus, these horrible, the fire in Maui, the small island states that, are really in existential peril, given a sea rise, the melting on the North and South poles. So these are fairly dramatic things, but they capture the imagination and people pay attention. And to think about how one shares the responsibility to either mitigate what's already, the damage that's already been done, or address them in some manner, and sort of find allies or ways to do that. I think is another concrete way in which students might be able to think about how to address some of these issues. I think the frustration comes where you may wish to act, but you don't feel action can have much impact. So I think to focus on something which is tangible, then to find connections, which students are amazingly able to to find those kinds of connections, either to facilitate dialogue or understanding, or indeed some more tangible action, I think are the opportunities which these terrible circumstances that we now experience provide us.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to other issues, but how do you think the pandemic has affected the discussion around global challenges such as climate change and peace?
I think the COVID-19 epidemic really very graphically showed us where there were inequalities, where there were structural deficiencies. Hoda mentioned the piece that I did about jurisdictions which had to do with American Indian tribes. The lack of infrastructure in these places, lack of water, and how actually even unto the present, they are now trying to address the vulnerabilities they encountered trying to deal with COVID by keeping themselves more isolated from the outside communities and so forth. So it really, I think, starkly revealed or reminded that these things existed and that something needed to be done about it. And that perhaps those who are in positions of responsibility have some duty to respond to those needs by either making sure there are resources to address those or otherwise to sort of fix the problem. So I think it did just reveal the huge inequities around the world that existed, where there were really very substantial infrastructure problems, which perhaps were known but ignorable, but no longer could be ignored when you had to deliver goods to certain places and so forth. So I think it just exposed things that may already have been there, hopefully bringing it more prominently to the attention of those who have some responsibility or means to address these things, including the leadership of these jurisdictions.
A couple of thoughts on COVID. The disease, I think, should have made us all aware of the fact that we're all human, we're all vulnerable. Admittedly, there are variations. Those of us who are older are a bit more vulnerable to COVID than younger people, for sure. But it was the interconnectedness of the world that was highlighted by the way that this disease spread. That should have been a teaching moment for us all in terms of understanding that regardless of how we draw boundaries, how we talk about nations, how we talk about jurisdictions, we are all human, we're all part of the biosphere, we're all vulnerable in more or less the same way. And the fear factor in terms of trying to do isolation and so on in the face of an unknown virus whose qualities, at least in the first few months, were simply not clear, should have suggested to us that we have a common interest in public health around the world. Unfortunately, we live in a world dominated in medical terms by some big pharmaceutical corporations that sort of took over the whole agenda on that. In a sensible world, those patents would have been bought out by some of the rich and powerful states very quickly and donated to any lab anywhere that could manufacture the necessary vaccines. We don't live in that world, unfortunately, but when it comes to public health, clearly we need to do collectively a whole lot better job at getting crucial medicines and crucial treatments to everybody. Because in fact, that's in the self-interests of the rich and powerful too. Precisely because if you are dealing with viruses and things that spread, then stopping the spread is the key to keeping everybody healthy. And that requires having vaccines that will get right across the population. And that's the way that you can dramatically reduce the spread. So everybody benefits. But unfortunately, we live in a world where rivalries and corporate control over health systems stymies that kind of innovation. The common humanity, the common vulnerability to disease, I think, is something that needs a whole lot more thinking about. It should have emphasized the interconnections, and instead populist politicians and that insidious term we all learned 2 or 3 years ago called vaccine nationalism simply made everything worse. What limited supplies were available were hogged by those who could afford them. I benefited. I got my vaccine long before somebody in the global south did. I'm very grateful that I got the vaccines, given the nastiness that comes from that disease, and the number of seniors in various communities that I'm connected with who didn't make it. That should be a teaching moment. We need to rethink how we do global health quite fundamentally. But I think the other point, of course, is that it suggested that, if I can borrow a phrasing from Carol Dumain, who said we maybe have national security, but we don't have a secure nations. And I think that the priority in terms of what it is that is being secured was also highlighted by COVID. What was being secured was a sort of a state-based institutional focus on some key parts of the economy. And I think that if we are serious about peace, if we're serious about getting to a world with a whole lot less violence, we have to focus in on who is being secured by what institutions, because the COVID pandemic has made it very clear that the national security institutions that are revered in many parts of the world as absolutely crucial are not crucial to keeping people healthy, and a shift in focus on how it is we understand security, who's secured, who's being secured by what measures. I think the COVID pandemic has really highlighted the necessity for rethinking, particularly the security dimensions of our institutions quite fundamentally. Time to get on that one.
I think two things that flow from what Simon just said. One is that sense of security and what appeared to be the government's inability to provide that security during the COVID period, I think eroded also public confidence and trust in public authority. And this then gave rise to all manner of conspiracy and whatever else might have been going on. Sometimes one simply didn't know, and not being able to really say that in a manner that didn't erode trust, but rather build confidence that someone's working on it, seemed to have been the reverse reaction. So that's one thing. The other is it also exposed, I think, sort of the governance chain just wasn't going in the right order. The World Health Organization can issue a directive saying we've got an international emergency. Well, those who are working on the international emergency are actually in the trenches in local spaces, not at national capitals. National capitals involved, yes, but it's mayors who actually are dealing with these things, or police people, on the ground. And not necessarily throwing through, lots of bureaucracy when you've got that kind of emergency. So that certainly spoke to who, these international directives need to be addressing and who needs to take action. Of course, coordinated in some manner with, larger authorities. So I think the erosion of public trust and authority, which are going to be fundamental to trying to make change. But if you don't have it, and it's been eroded in something as basic as personal health, it's, this is a hard slog to rebuild that. And then when the international authorities are not addressing those that can take most effective action, is a governance issue that needs to be addressed. I think COVID showed those.
Yeah, and just to follow up on points that both of you have made that are so relevant to the COVID crisis, I think that was a perfect example of this interdependent world, as Simon, you used that term, how that interdependent world just failed during COVID. For all the reasons that were just mentioned by both of you, it really brought to the surface the dysfunctions of this current system. And I think added to it was, from my perspective, a lack of a moral framework, a moral understanding of responsibility to other human beings at a time of crisis, at a time of this horrific disease that was devastating populations throughout the world. And yet some nations had enough to go around, but held on to the vaccines. And so I think it was a very good example of how peace and security are just not possible if we continue to respond in this way, which is not very effective at all.
So aside from the dysfunction at the international or at the global level, what are some of the other significant challenges to peace that you think we have to address?
To me, I think one big one is that we know when conflicts or challenges begin, but we like to see an end, a defined end, and we prefer to know when that end is going to take place. The nature, however, of the issues that we face now, whether it's the climate or even something like COVID, is that they are ongoing. They continue. There may not be a defined end. It may be just episodic. It's just the one phase moving into another phase. And governments, politics are not so good at sort of understanding things as a flow. We want to, be the problem solver. We fix the problem, we move on. We leave the problem behind us. It's this kind of thinking, where in fact the consequences of these things may endure, or in fact something like the COVID will continue, and we'll all have to adjust to ongoing vaccinations. Aspects of climate change are going to be with us for a long time to come, and cannot be fixed with one single great idea. A single great idea will help improve circumstances, but may well create something else that needs to be addressed. So I think our ability to sort of understand things in a more continuous flow mode rather than a fix-it mode is one of the big challenges. And this actually includes conflict. Conflicts, as we see, we think something has been fixed and peace treaty has been signed, or some kind of peace accord has been made, and then before you know it, it's flared up again. So one has to be mindful of the fact that these things are not necessarily always settled, and not to feel that necessarily there is failure when it resurfaces, but have the ability to recognize it for what it is and deal with it as it comes up.
One of the more interesting and optimistic angles on the peace and climate discussion is precisely that a whole bunch of scholars are now working on environmental peacemaking, trying to suggest that in fact environmental cooperation can be used as a tool to reduce conflict and hopefully, to Charlotte's point, to prevent future flare-ups. In many cases, resource access issues in rural areas are part and parcel of local conflicts, at least, even enough the bigger ones, and therefore actually addressing some of the basic political economy, access to resources, justice issues on the ground on the small scale is actually crucial to peace building. A lot of the climate change discussion go back to the 1990s was, would it cause conflict? The answer is mostly not, because the reasons why conflict happens are not directly related to climate change. They're indirectly related to the disruptions that might be made worse by climate change, which isn't quite the same thing. But the debate in the last few years has been, can we turn this all on its head? Stop and think about environmental cooperation actually as a route to peace building. If you can build institutions that enhance cooperation, and on environmental issues, things like water supplies, you need to cooperate across boundaries if you want to have reliable water supplies. it actually allows the whole thing to be turned on its head. So we actually think about, well, how do you build more resilient environments that, with cooperative institutions? This should filter up by simply reducing potential conflicts, by also, in the old functionalist argument, about simply inducing the habits of cooperation, getting used to working with people, because you have to run the pumps or adjust the levels on the dams or whatever it is around water conflict, simply induces cooperation. But it crucially also suggests some clear procedures and rules of who will do what in a crisis. And of course, that's crucial to often preventing conflict, because if it isn't clear who should do what when circumstances change, then everybody starts arguing about who should do what, with the potential for spiraling into conflict. So basic environmental cooperation is at the grassroots level is now being looked at as a peace-building mechanism. And again, I think that that's most promising because it does actually focus on things that can be done in practical terms. It's not easy in many places. It does, in many cases, run fairly directly into the difficulties in many rural areas, the conflicts caused by extractivist projects, whether they're plantations, big agriculture displacing local producers, whether it's mines polluting indigenous lands. All of these things are tricky. But if you actually turn the whole discussion on its head and say, well, how do we use environment as a mode of peacemaking? Then there's all sorts of potential benefits. And it's been really interesting over the last decade to see people rethinking the conflict environment thing and saying, wait a minute, we need to do it the other way. We need to look at environment as a mode in which we can actually facilitate building institutions based on cooperation. And hence, peace is the long-term goal, because it prevents those flare-ups that Charlotte was talking about just a moment ago. So there's some good news on the peace environment scene, which we need to amplify and work on more.
And I think sort of rethinking what peace actually means. Peace, in my view, does not necessarily mean the total absence of conflict or competition. It's actually how you pursue that conflict and competition, which is the challenge. And I think that is also what some of what Simon has just described can help us understand, that one can still have differing interests, competing interests, conflicting interests, even historical conflicts, but nevertheless, there may be a way in which you pursue those, or you try to resolve those, that do not necessarily have to resort to violence. I think that's the piece that we also need to focus on. What are their alternative methods to dealing with some of these issues that do not have to dissolve into violence or damage? Because ultimately, if you destroy something, you've destroyed it for everyone. So everyone's interests are harmed in that respect. So at least if that could be a starting point, that might be something.
Thank you. So I want to bring in a question from the audience now, and it's a question about something we've sort of touched on, but not specifically addressed in terms of justice. So Sue Emmel's asking, what role might the International Criminal Court play in bringing crimes against humanity to justice? But maybe we can also think about the question of justice in a larger sense too there.
I think actions of institutions like the International Criminal Court, like most courts, can only go so far. They are more helping to, in my view at least, define and perhaps develop some concepts so that one can understand, on the one hand, what some consequences are, on the other hand, what some responsibilities are with regard to a particular action that is taken. So while there is certainly punishment and sanction that is part of litigation and the bringing to International Criminal Court and prosecutions and the like, I think the more important function these kinds of cases can perform is actually to help build the law, but in a manner that helps us understand more understand more deeply, really, what is the responsibility that one should have under these particular circumstances at an individual or collective level.
Thank you. I have one more audience question, which is a hypothetical question, but hopefully won't remain hypothetical for too long. As one of the most influential soft power actors, how would a female president in the United States influence peace and climate change discourses?
You know, that's given the present system that we have, I don't know whether that would change things immensely.
If I might get 2 bits worth in on that, the usual counter argument is that, you know, the gender of the leader doesn't actually matter very much. Remember Margaret Thatcher going to war in the Falklands, or, you know, Golda Meir being the Prime Minister of Israel during wars. Indira Gandhi didn't exactly have an unblemished record either. I think that the answer is more structural than it is specifically gendered. Hopefully, any female president of the United States, much less a female president, Prime Minister of Canada, or name your other country that you're concerned with, might intuitively not react to sort of the escalating rhetoric of a crisis in quite the same way, one hopes. But I think that the larger structural questions remain to be dealt with. We've seen some inspirational younger female leaders. I'm thinking of Finland and New Zealand recently, and they sure have tried. But, you know, yet when you get to the question of Finland joining NATO, there was be no doubt, you know, going to go along with the general flow, regardless of the gender of the leader. I think that the larger structural questions do need addressing here. I'm all in favor of having more female participation in politics. Don't get me wrong on that. It's long overdue. I am lucky enough, I'm actually a long way, Charlotte, from the Balsillie School today, the other side of Canada, where we actually have probably the best member of parliament in the country, in Elizabeth May, who happens to be a quite wonderful environmental and peace activist in this particular part of Canada. She's great. The problem is there's very few of her, and we really do need to emphasize this. Clearly, the social science literature on this is fairly clear. If you get a critical mass, I hate that phrase, but it came to my tongue too quickly, of women participating in any organization, the organizational dynamics change. And I think in that sense, a female president of the US wouldn't change a lot. But if there were dozens of female prime ministers and presidents around the world, we might well see a better world, a more peaceful one, insofar as gender does matter in larger organizational structure. But it does usually, not always, but it does usually need to have a substantial female presence to actually make that structural difference. So the answer to the question is, yes, a female president would help in the United States if there's a whole bunch of female presidents and prime ministers in other parts of the world to work with. And I think that this is one of the larger global issues in terms of getting more diverse participation in politics in numerous parts of the world, because frankly, us stale pale males have run things for altogether too long.
So one final question for us to wrap up with. What makes you all hopeful for the future or inspires you to continue despite the obvious challenges that we face?
Well, there's always hope, because we've seen it throughout the centuries, even at the lowest point of any given issue or problem in the world. There's something about the human spirit that pulls through. So I think we have to remain hopeful. We have to, especially on a college campus, we have to engage our students in conversations about constructive ways of improving the world, and always taking the time to hear students from different backgrounds, different perspectives give their views about this issue. But always for, I would say as a faculty member, I would always like to be about hope, given the fact that even right now, the world is not in a very hopeful place, but there are ways that we can always remain hopeful.
My two bits worth, the photographs from London and various other places in the last couple of weeks of people protesting the violence in Gaza gives me hope that an awful lot of people, whatever the politicians may say, don't want to live in a world of war and don't want to live in a world where our political options are narrowed down to violent conflict to solve difficulties. And I think that's the one thing that you know, the other side of the coin, I've already mentioned my electric bike, which I love. But the fact that we also need to understand that the world is changing technologically incredibly fast. I don't really know where the heck a lot of these changes are going. I worry about AI, like so many other people do. On the other hand, the potentials to do all sorts of things we couldn't do even a couple of generations ago are there. The task for the current generation of students is to grapple with these things and use them in positive ways to assist in making a better world rather than just as tools of competition. And the speed of technological change in vehicles, in all sorts of things, does open up possibilities that for the future. The trick, of course, is to seize them and to use them for constructive purposes. But both of those things, the mass insistence that violence is not the answer that we've seen in protests right around the world in the last few weeks, I find very encouraging. And also the speed at which new technologies are emerging may have all sorts of peaceful implications if we're willing to grasp them and try to use them.
I think the enthusiasm that students have to do something about problems they see, find those opportunities actually to be present. Over a spring break at Texas, I was struck by how many students, you know, a year or so ago found themselves in Poland just to render assistance to, you know, the various Ukrainian populations that were coming to Poland. I had no idea how they got there. In fact, the university was somewhat blindsided and thought, oh my goodness, you know, do we have responsibility here for these people, you know, working in these areas? But they're fearless. They want to contribute. They want to make a difference, and they find their way to do that. I think that's amazing. So when one gets wind of this, I think then to, you know, connect them to the appropriate authorities, make their contributions known, because that highlighting, I think, can be part of, you know, ongoing development of a good governance and response system. So I think capitalizing on those individual impulses, encouraging public service, I think is incredibly important. Part of our frustration sometimes with our political systems, but then you know, someone asked me recently, so, you know, did you ever get involved in political life? You know, and it's like, oh, well, maybe not so much. Well, maybe one does have to get involved in political life. So I think to encourage political service, to engage in some form of, that is to encourage public service and to, you know, get involved in the politics and beyond the protesting, to take those protesting and, you know, really perhaps move into some of the more formal political kinds of engagements that ultimately, you know, hopefully will help to produce some change in direction in policy and the like. But there is that energy, there is that courage, I mean, a true fearlessness, and I think innovative spirit, but yet grounded now with, you know, good education, good backgrounds, good structures, good techniques, informed about a variety of toolkits, at least in the law, whether that's, you know, domestic law, international law, regional law, various kinds. Students have tremendous resources that they can draw upon to engage with some of these issues and to also make them fearless with regard to engaging, as we were talking about earlier, with individuals and people who are sort of, you know, beyond their usual community. I think these are all ways in which we can gain a hope for the future.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to hand the time back over to Hoda now, as we only have a couple of minutes left. That time went really
Yes.
quickly, so thank you.
Thank you so much. both Simon and Charlotte, and Kate, thank you for moderating so beautifully. I think it was a very important conversation at a very important time, and there were a lot of great ideas that were shared with our audience, and we hope that we can put them to use in our lives, and hopefully we'll see great results come out of those. Just to remind you that you can purchase the book if you would like by going to the link that will be put in the chat box. Of course, you see the link on your screen, but it'll also be put in the chat box for you to copy. And I would like to remind you that this is the last event for our fall semester, but in spring semester of 2024, my goodness, these years are going by fast. We have in February, on February 13, we have an in-person event, Antagonistic Cooperation. Professor Robert O'Mealy, who's written a recent book on the history of jazz, jazz music. He will be the speaker. A very, very interesting book that he has just published, and he's quite renowned in this area of jazz and music. Then February 27, also an in-person event, Equity in Education by Dr. Jennifer King Rice, who is the provost at the University of Maryland. So we hope that you will go to our website and follow us on our social media so that you know when to sign up for these events. Again, my thanks to all the participants, especially Dr. Dalby and Koo and Dr. Seaman for your valuable insights today. Thank you very much. Until next time.